Okay, that gives me the opportunity to finally ask Jack Self on the stage. Jack Self is an architect and a writer based in London. He has been very active at the Architectural Association, studying there and doing actually as a student a student magazine on architecture called Fulcrum, which was very widely read and generated a lot of polemics. He started the Real Foundation, which is basically his professional structure, in which he realizes the various kinds of projects he's doing, among them the Real Review. It obviously always has to do with the reality of real estate and the question on how architecture and how space is commodified and which opportunities we have to kind of turn this commodification against itself, and just in the way that he just asked his question to Anna. He has been most recently the curator, actually still is because it's still running, of the British Pavilion at the Architecture Biennale in Venice, which dealt with the question of how we can actually use the house or the space of living in more ways than one, also not only in terms of space, but actually how we can identify different time zones in the act of living. He has, we have talked about before his talk, and we went through 3 different scenarios of what he could talk about and what order, and I'm very curious to see which one he has actually chosen.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you so much for this invitation, and also it's such an amazing group of people who presented, and been very inspiring to see all this work. I actually changed completely the projects I was going to present, and so now you're getting 2 very quick bonus projects, which are, let's say, just in response to what's happened today. This is a project that I'll show you very, very quickly, just in response to some of these others. This is called Empire Hotel. It's part of a series which began as a trilogy, but there are now 4 buildings in the series, begun in 2012, called Derivative Architecture. I won't go into the details of what that means, but it's basically looking to the idea of designing financial systems as a way to create certain types of spatial conditions, and really suggesting that a lot of the problem that we face in architecture is that the terms and conditions of the finance that we use to build are already predetermined by the time we start the role as architects. So often, whether or not, for example, a developer needs to pay the money back within a certain period of time determines whether it's a rental property or whether it's immediately for sale. If it's for sale, things have to last 15 years maximum because no one cares, it'll be sold by that point. If it's rental, suddenly you find that they're interested in 25, 30 years and you get a higher quality building. There's the architecture itself, to use a kind of cliche, form follows finance, is extremely important. In this case, this building is very much about a kind of rejection of its context. This is Trafalgar Square in London, which is the heart of the administrative empire, let's say. And this is on the site of South Africa House, which of course was a center for anti-apartheid protests during the 80s. It suggests demolishing the building and replacing it with this huge blank facade, which completely rejects the city. But as a building, what it actually is a hotel for the creative classes. The idea is that it's basically an association. You pay an annual membership fee, and it gives you the right to spend 1 night of the year in any of the buildings that would be built identically around the world. There's also, with the condition that you can't spend more than 3 months in any one location. The reason for this is you then stop being a resident in any country, and you stop paying income tax, and you, in effect, withdraw from the state. It also creates a certain equality because there's a financial arbitrage which occurs where the cost of running this in Mexico City is very low, the cost of running it in London is very high, but you pay a flat fee because you're effectively splitting the cost between these different environments. And the idea is also, I was very inspired by visiting the Chelsea Hotel in New York when I was in my early 20s, and there is the possibility, or there was before it was turned into luxury apartments, to swap artistic labor for a space. So you could pay your rent by giving a piece of art or a piece of sculpture, or one could imagine now in an increasingly digital and immaterial world that you might help someone with web programming or do artistic direction for something. One could imagine many ways in which labor could be swapped for rent. In terms of the typology, well, I'll speak just about the interior. I'm very interested by this question of luxury and the limit of luxury. I mean, we mentioned Lacton Vassal earlier, this aesthetics of luxury, where it begins. And in this case, basically, the hotel room and the monastic cell have a huge amount of connection to each other. They're both effectively, let's say, minimum interiors. And I did some informal research with the British populace to discover where the limits of luxury are. And I kept adding things to this image until it became luxurious for the people I was asking. And it turns out the two really important things for the British, or three important things, one is marble. They think that's very luxurious. The other is brass. They think that's very gold. They're super into that. And the third, which I kind of required some psychological understanding, was the Turkish rug or Persian rug, which is really like the kind of typical, you see this a lot in Swiss architecture, the inclusion of the Persian rug, which become in a way the like archetypal bourgeois textile, which gives you just enough color and almost like exoticism, but not too much that it's like a pattern on a wall or in any way disturbing the purity of the space. So I find this, let's say, interesting. Anyway, the typology is really what I wanted to show you, which is, and this is, you don't ever enter it at ground level. You enter it through a subterranean access to really emphasize its disconnect from its context. And in typological sense, basically, there's the possibility for these partitions to open, thereby creating this infinitely extendable and potentially communal property. We move on. I wanted to show you this very quickly. I'm not going to read them, but I just kind of wanted to indicate that they're there because in my presentation, I make reference to the real foundation and which is, it is my company at the moment, but it won't be my company for very much longer. I'll explain that more in a minute. But these are, in a way, we're talking about, let's say, how to form certain strategies. And these strategies are very important to me in terms of thinking about what architecture can do. Anyway, I return to that later. The first thing is really, when we talk about luxury, to give some context to this, we started talking about conditions of ownership. Many of you will be familiar with Agamben's work on monastic categories of ownership. I mean, this has been very influential on me, partly because, as in the next project I'll show, the monastery is, in a way, an ideal form of community. I mean, I'm an atheist Jew, so it's not a religious thing for me. But the cenobi, which is the community of monks, is a very interesting concept because each monk has total autonomy and individuality within their own space. And they only practice certain activities together, namely praying and eating, which reinforce the ideology of the community. And so what you have really is like a community of individuals, which I think is a very important way for understanding. I mean, in many ways, the problems of, let's say, communist architecture for me are often that they make the mistake of thinking that communism means everyone being together all the time, which causes this stress that we described. So there are four categories of Franciscan ownership. The first is use. This is when the act of owning the thing destroys the thing. So cup of coffee, a glass of water, you can't own it because as soon as you attempt to own it, it's gone. The second is usufruct, which means the right to use or the right of access. I don't know if you have it in Switzerland, but in the UK we have a right of access, which is often to do with old paths through forests or through fields. And anyone has the right. They're public paths, even though they are not part of in the private territory. Another good one is the commons itself. I mean, the right to, for example, put your animals onto a common field in a village. This is the right of usufruct. It's not specific ownership, but it's more a kind of legal right. Possession is, you often hear, it's nice to be in Switzerland to say this actually, like Philippe Patek watch. They say, you never own a Philippe Patek watch, you just hold on to it for the next generation. This is possession, basically. And often you see aristocrats in Britain, they'll say, well, I don't really own my estate, I'm just a caretaker for the next generation, which is a disingenuous way of describing their privilege. And then you have dominion, which in the religious sense is the right to destroy something. It's not even the right to own something, it's the right to take away its life. So if you have the right, and this applies to, in the traditional religious context, also the right to own people. And I mean, we should be very suspicious also of like wedding vows. I'm getting married in May. And it's the first time I've really looked at wedding vows. And there's like all of this stuff about transferal of property. And it seems to me very much to do with this like total control over something. So these are the 4 categories of ownership. And when we're talking about luxury commons, we have to be very clear as to whether we're talking about, because luxury is the excess. I mean, we've kind of heard it described both today as a kind of excess and also as an elitism, but it is really excess, it's surplus, it's the thing which is generated in more than we need. But what is that thing? Is it an object that we have the right, therefore, to destroy? Is it access to a thing? Is it the right to certain spaces? So these, I thought, were very, interesting things for me to explore as part of this research into this very interesting topic, I think. First project I present is Cenobium, housing for the 99%. After the Great Fire of London in 1666, about 80% of the city was destroyed. And Christopher Wren, who did St. Paul's Cathedral and a bunch of other important buildings, had the idea of redesigning the center of the city along what he called the Italianate plaza model, with a kind of radiating plaza model. And the citizens of London grouped together and put together a petition basically resisting the redistribution of land, which they were very suspicious of people redrawing the boundaries of their properties. So they wanted it rebuilt exactly as it was. And even though the king supported Christopher Wren, this was upheld and became the first ever building act. This is very important because building regulations, in a way, try to control what you can and can't do in a building. A building act is really like systematic instructions for building cities. And what they realized was the only form of industrial production at that time was maritime. I mean, this is 1600s. So they based the entire redesign of the city on the longest piece of wood that was available in the shipyards. And that was called a chain. It's about 12 meters long. So they took 1 acre model. They divided it into 10 square chains. They divided each of those into 4 rods. And then they divided that into half. And half of that became the house and half of it became the garden. You got 40 plots per acre. You got 80 homes per 2 acres. And what you ended up, 93% of London is still based on this model. It's an extremely, up until the end of the 1900s, they still used to do all of the plans, the maps of the city in chains because it was not useful to do it in miles. And it became a very kind of important model because at the same time what they said was there are only going to be 4 classes of house now. And these 4 classes of house are effectively the same plan at different scales. And the reason for that was that there was obviously a strong in the rebuilding, builders were thinking, we're just going to build luxury housing. We're not going to build workers' housing. We're going to make a big profit. So they created a building act in which the density of the houses changes depending on what class you're building, but you're always limited by the same 2-acre plot. And what that means is that it's not more profitable to build working class housing than to build luxury housing because you can get more working class in the same space. So you get a certain amount of profit, or you can build fewer houses, but they're more expensive, and it's exactly the same, which I think is also, in terms of how we think about cities today, creating no incentive. Basically, this meant that in certain areas, people built whatever housing was needed, not what was most profitable, and I think that's very powerful. I'm not going to go into this guy too much, except to say that he was the first ever developer. His name was Nicholas Barbon. He's described by his rivals as ruthlessly flamboyant. He got into huge levels of debt, but what he developed was, again, 100 years before the Industrial Revolution, he was in a house that he was building, and he thought it was taking too long, and he complained to the carpenter, and the carpenter said, well, what do you want? I mean, I've got to build the steps each time. And it was the handrail that was a particularly complex thing to do in houses because all the floor heights were different. And he said, right, okay, we're just going to do one house. You're going to make 10 staircases in your atelier, and we're going to bring them basically prefabricating the homes. And very, very quickly, he developed a technique to prefabricate windows, doors, fireplaces, all sorts of interior detailings. I mean, it was really an amazing... and as a result, he could build 5 or 6 times faster than almost anyone else. At that time, the most that anyone had built in one go was 16 houses. His second project was for 450 houses, and like no one had ever seen this before. And he built so fast that there were a lot of commons fields around London that were basically left over from when Henry VIII destroyed all the monasteries. They were technically belonged to the people, and anyone could use them. And he built so quickly that he turned, this is Red Line Fields in 1672, and this is it 5 years later, or 1678, I think. He completely like bulldozed over it. And by the time the law caught up with him, the only thing they could save was the square. And even that, eventually, actually, a few years later, he managed to put a fence around it and turn it into a private space, which is why so many, I mean, London and Britain is the only place in the world where you have a typology of housing that goes directly onto a square. And this is why, because they built it so quickly, and it was only by the law that they were forced to leave these types of open spaces. Although eventually, once they worked out, they could put a fence around it and enclose the commons and effectively kill the commons. They became great attractors for developers. Anyway, so the project that I proposed was basically to invert this relationship, so to destroy the party wall, to look for how we could reconstitute or reformulate or reinvent the commons within this extremely partitioned concept of London property. And the first thing I did was remove the party walls and replace it with a core. The second thing was I took all the infrastructure and services and the activities and made them basically on an equal hierarchy within the core. And that led to a kind of modular system in which pieces of furniture, but also other pieces of utilities could be inserted or removed over time to change the function of the spaces. That's the kind of base unit. And the idea was that you would begin with kind of individual units with specific activities, but that over time you would be able to remove these partition walls, and that you may eventually even begin to have, let's say, quite large communal forms of life, which we maybe can't imagine now what they would be like. That's how the infrastructure operates. It's a kind of anti-domino, maison domino, because maison domino, looks super flexible, but it's not. You can't change a column. There's very actually few possibilities for changing the internal layout. And so this, in a sense, looks much more rigid than the domino, but in fact tries to provide a much more flexible and also less prescriptive space, because you can remove these floors. They're all cantilevered, so you could change the height of the ceilings over time and so on. It also means that the facade, and particularly the stairs, they bear their own load, so they're independent of the interior. And it's designed as a kind of emergent system where you could imagine people or even cooperatives buying up houses in a street and over time combining them in order to destroy. What was important to me was not that we can see where the boundary of each house is. There should be no blurred. This is really a project against individuation, against private property, against the individuality of the home. And you see it in the facade, but also in section, where the stairs, where you have one building, the stairs operate like a normal building. But when you put them next to each other, actually, your street number and your house location are no longer connected. They're completely divergent, which also destroys this possibility of being identified by your location. That's the kind of house block that you get, which also is open at the corner in this so-called swirl, which I like very much myself. I'm a big fan of the swirl. I wish there was a better name for this, but it's great. Anyway, so the idea is to also destroy all of the internal private gardens. It's the swirl. Yeah, swirl. So here's the swirl block of 2 acres. The ground floor is always a communal space in every building. And every block is obviously open. These are some of the kind of possible internal arrangements of the space, from the kind of, let's say, individual monastic condition to the problematic condition of the couple. I mean, I work from home. I'm about to open my own office, but until I do next month, I still work from home probably 3 days a week, and it's problematic because my girlfriend works on a traditional work schedule. So she finishes work at 6 or 7. She goes off to the office at 8. And whereas I will often work until 1 or 2 in the morning. And when you're in a small space, that becomes an extremely complex space of conflict. So in a way, trying to imagine a housing model which can accommodate the perpetual conflict in which we no longer even share rhythms, biological rhythms and daily rhythms of labor is very problematic. Anyway, you can take out floors and begin to imagine, let's say, different scenarios for engagement. In terms of the placement within City of London, I did a study into what's called the, it's like an aggregate poverty index, which includes also lack of access to education, health, lack of social mobility. And what you find is that the borough of Kensington and Chelsea has the highest level of wealth inequality of any place on the planet. It has between the top, which is in the bottom 1% of British society. It's some of the poorest people in all of Britain, and the bottom, which is amongst the top 0.1%. For them to be in the same administrative region is kind of insane. But so in a way, this project then begins to acquire sites within areas which have a very low quality of urban space, and it attempts to, let's say, alter those conditions in a very kind of organic and aggregate way to try and give back some of these commons. And in terms of, let's say, the drawing style, it's very important to me that you really feel the pressure and oppression of this constantly divided city, and then the, let's say, liberty of the space that's given back. So, one swirl concept number 2, beginning to get a bit boring, came up with another swirl concept, double swirl. And that's that project. The real foundation itself is kind of an interesting one because it was originally conceived as a, well, I wanted to start my own firm, and I wanted to start it with a partner. And what we immediately discovered was that actually there are a couple of things that well, basically what it is it's an architectural firm which has a mission statement and articles of association and a board of trustees that makes it operate like a foundation. And this means there are only certain types of projects that the architecture firm can do. And the reason for this is really to prevent like mission creep, because as an architect, what you often find is that you have a very strong commitment to certain types of work. But, there's always the temptation of maybe I can just do this and I can use that money to offset this other project which is not that. And in fact, I know many architects who in their early 30s, which is when most architects begin, they are quite radical and they have very strong beliefs and strong ideas. And by their early 50s, they've completely lost all direction. They've become comfortable. They've become, complacent. And in order to prevent that, because I don't trust the other people in Britain because they voted for Brexit, but I also don't really trust myself because I know how tempting capitalism is. So I wanted to write into the structure of the firm from the beginning an impossibility of being tempted by things which I don't believe in, and I hope I will not change my views in the future. But this also means that at the moment we do a magazine, we do exhibitions, but hopefully next year we will start to do housing projects. Social housing mostly, only there's one project and it's social housing, but the 100% social housing. But it's also like I only ever entered 2 competitions in my life, both time for the British Pavilion. First time I lost, second time I won. So I've decided not to do any more competitions because I think 50% is a good ratio. But the idea behind this is also that you take away as well the pressure of scale, because there's often a lot of judgment made by non-architects about, they say, okay, you're an architect, or what buildings have you done? It's like, well, I publish books and magazines and I do a lot of conceptual projects and we're really struggling to build, but that's our ambition. And they're like, oh, so you're not really an architect then. And it's like, what I really want to insist is that the ideas which manifest themselves in a small exhibition, in something like the British Pavilion, in a magazine, and in a building, can all be equally valid forms of architectural expression. And therefore, this idea of having a foundation that also does buildings is therefore to say that even every piece of architecture is also a cultural experiment. I think we saw several examples today, particularly from duplex architecture, in which the building itself is a form of cultural experiment, which in many conditions become very, very difficult to achieve. Anyway, I'm going to show you very quickly, this project, this is the British Pavilion this year in Venice. It's called Home Economics. I'm not going to go too much into the detail of that. I just want to focus on one aspect of it. But in principle, what it was an exhibition proposing 5 new models for domestic life. It was an exhibition that was arranged through period of time of occupation in the home. It's, as far as I'm aware, the first exhibition to be arranged through time spent in the home. And what the meaning of this is really to say, as architects, we often think about, is it urban, is it rural, is it expensive, is it low cost, what's the socioeconomic status, what are the other demographic status? If you take that away and say, what does it mean to live in a space for days? What do you actually need? You can begin to create the pursuit of what I think is a kind of more universal and more inclusive form of architecture, because it's really addressing a common human condition. It's not about whether you're wealthy or poor or whether you live in the countryside or not. So each of the 5 homes, let's say, with the 5 time periods, hours, days, months, years, and decades, were done by different architects. I did the hours space in collaboration with my 2 other curators, and then the other spaces, days was done by an art collective called Air, months was done by Dogma and Black Square, years was done by a super interesting Venezuelan, a British architect called Julia King. Well, unfortunately, I can't go into their work too much right now, but and decades was done by a super interesting British Scandinavian firm called Hassel Brandt. And the concept was really to do kind of full-scale models, let's say. So we took the designs that each group did and we shrunk them down to the scale of an architectural maquette, and then we blew them up to be full-scale spaces. Because in that process, as you'll know from making maquettes, you have to go through a process of abstraction, and what you end up with is really the essence of the architecture, because you can't show, if you decide to show a Persian rug at 1 to 500, it must be very important. You end up basically with just the qualities of space. So this was our way of doing that. The hours space, which was the central space, relates to an architectural project that I designed, and also 2 pieces of furniture which I designed, which I hope to make at least the daybed commercially available, because I also think if you look at the modernists, people like Jean Prouvé, they made most of their income from the sale of door handles, windows, chairs. And in a way, the architect now becomes so dependent on each commission and has less and less the autonomy or the space for, let's say, independent research. I mean, in order to lose all these competitions, it's super expensive. I can't enter competitions because I can't afford the labor time. The risk is too high. So in a way, creating structures within the firm which mitigate that risk and which minimize that risk are important to me. The 2 pieces of furniture attempt to address this idea of sharing as a type of luxury, not as a compromise. The first is what I call the garderobe. Probably you have this word in German, I think. In British, it's an extremely archaic word. It's not really used since medieval times. We use wardrobe, which just means place where you store your clothes. But garderobe is much more interesting because it's where you keep objects safe. It's a secure location. So in this case, a garderobe in which the entire structure is made out of plexiglass, so there's completely transparent, was intended to force the individual into a relationship with their objects. Because traditionally we always look to create more storage in the home, but why? So that we can consume more and conceal it. If you're forced to consider your objects in a more direct way, not only does it create interesting relationships between different categories of object, but it hopefully also consider or encourage you to have less. In this particular space, the idea here was that the objects are part of a shared household. I'm probably over on time. Okay. This particular space is imagined as a shared space within a common household. So there's kind of 4 households that share this room. And therefore, these objects become also part of the kind of common property of the home. And I think the vacuum cleaner is the best indicator of this, because we don't all need vacuum cleaners. We really only need 1, like even per street. And the concept here with design through time is that when you look at the plan, as I mentioned earlier, when you look at the plan and you look at ownership as a static activity in time, everyone needs their own vacuum cleaner because everyone is vacuuming simultaneously. But as soon as you begin to consider things with a longevity, categories of ownership completely change. I think it's really interesting that Uber, their slogan is your own private driver. And it's like, yeah, because when you're in the car, you have possession of the car. It goes exactly where you want to go. But as soon as you leave the car, you have no category of ownership over it. So it's a totally temporal form of ownership. And I'm interested basically in how the sharing economy, I think the sharing economy is a wonderful thing, but at the moment it's being used to extract latent profit from an existing infrastructural base. And that profit is going to companies like Airbnb, Uber, we have Deliveroo, I'm sure you have also these other equivalents. It would be interesting if the sharing economy were also a cooperative or communalized structure. Then it really becomes an optimized way to communally own things. And this is what this project and this piece of furniture really tries to do. The clothes in here were done by a British fashion designer called J.W. Anderson, and the brief to him was to create a wardrobe that was age neutral and gender neutral, to really kind of make the most possibility for sharing of clothes. The other piece of furniture was the day bed. In 2014 in Britain, the bed overtook the sofa for the first time as the most used piece of furniture. And this is very important because basically 80% of us are looking at our phones within 5 minutes of waking up in the morning and 5 minutes of going to bed. It means we're doing work emails in bed. It means that we're watching increasingly catch-up services like Netflix, or we have also the iPlayer. So we're doing entertainment and communication and socializing in bed. And this has basically completely overtaken the sofa. And therefore, my question was, well, if we're now working and sleeping and even eating, because in many cases where there's overcrowding, the bed, your room is now a micro apartment, so you eat your meal in bed as well. How can we turn this into a positive thing? And how also can we create this possibility for a certain type of luxury out of this condition? And so the idea was that each bed is actually quite narrow. They're only 70 centimeters, which is below the minimum, but they have this shelf down the side. And the idea is that as an individual, it becomes a space for work or for sleep or leisure. When you put two of them next to each other, you have the possibility to create a certain type of space of dialogue. And when you put three of them together, it becomes like a kind of Roman triclinium in as much as you have a space that's between the three beds, which can be used for meals or for sharing a space in the middle. And therefore and beyond that it becomes something else, like by 4 or 5 you have like great space for an orgy. It's like, it really suggests many other uses. And this was part of let's say an architectural project to explore this idea of functionless space, not pre-programming the space, universal space, and therefore also the possibility of, through very simple means, of creating these spaces of commonality. That's the kind of idea. It's a space designed completely just around the bed, the day bed, and the garderobe. And this then becomes extremely ambiguous as to whether it's a private or a common space. I'm not going to go too much more into that, although obviously there's a lot of aesthetic decisions which are made here, but I'm going to, I think, leave it at that. Thank you.
Great, thanks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Does this work? Yes. Questions? Again, this is the last time that you can do it.
Hello. Hello?
Just keep
Yep.
talking.
Thank you for your presentation. I really appreciated it and enjoyed it. I have a question about your working method.
Can it be a bit louder, please? Here, our voice.
And it has something to do with, it's about the conflict between specificity and the specific and the universal. Last night we were at this wonderful place together, and we talked a little bit about how
It's called Vatek.
Vatek, yeah. And it's a former brewery, and there are very specific conditions of the architecture of the building itself, that it was this factory, it had certain types of materials, and it was those specific conditions that allowed the, I'd say, an unusual model to come out for a communal space. And I was also thinking about, say, something like, I'm a member of the Park Slope Food Co-op, which is one of the few working co-ops in the world. We have thousands and thousands of members, but it really emerges out of a very specific real estate condition and a specific mix of people. And I'm looking at your work, which I really absolutely love, and I see that in your working methodology, a lot of it is from the inside out, and that there's a kind of university, you're sort of starting with the basic unit. And we see that in a lot of the things that you showed today. And I was wondering if maybe you could unpack that a little bit for us and talk about that relationship between the tension between the two, between the specific and the universal, and how you are envisioning this working in your practice.
I think that's a really good question. I have a lot of difficulty in resolving the let's say politics of the interior, and because they're almost in a way only very, very talented architects are able to resolve simultaneously the relationship of the building to its context and the interior politics, the politics of the interior, and in a way, let's say, drawing a plan which cuts across the scale of like the Nolly plan that cuts across the scale of the city and the scale of the building. I'm not talented enough as an architect to deal with that. And also, I mean, a lot of my early work, I'm really trying to change this position now. I've been, let's say, I've been practicing as an architect now for 5 years. And when I first started, I was really...
And there's a period that you call your early work?
Well, no, this is still early work, but I had to change my approach because a lot of my designs from like 2011, for example, were very angry designs. They were very much in opposition to the city. They very much, I set out to basically tell the city, fuck you, because at that time I was very involved with the Occupy movement. I was involved with the Economic Working Group. I left architecture school to do a master's in philosophy, majoring in the morality of neoliberal economic theory, because I really wanted to be up on my shit as far as this goes. And so a lot of my projects are really, let's say, critical of the state and the fact that the state and democracy as a whole has, in my opinion, failed in its principal. Even the extreme neoliberals would say this, in its principal role, which is to represent the will of the people and to govern in their best interest. And now, as I'm actually, let's say, beginning to try and have built work done, you have to create a strategy for how you're going to engage with forces of power in a positive way. And you can't always do projects which are in opposition. And therefore, let's say, I'm coming now to a realization that I need to really make much more sophisticated the relationship of the building to the city. It can't be a kind of stroppy teenager. It really needs to have a much more nuanced and mature response. And that's something I'm working on, but I'm very sensitive to this difficulty. But of course, the other thing is that the work that I do is almost always a product of a financial situation. And therefore, in the case of London, you have such high property values that the only way to achieve low-cost housing is to do two things simultaneously. One is to find the smallest possible site with the highest possible volume, and the other is to change the terms over which you repay money. So, if you have a 50-year loan versus a 25-year loan, you pay a lot more in interest, but the monthly payments become a lot less. So in a sense, it's always a balance between these different factors, which almost always produce towers. It's not that I want to design towers. I can't really find another way. The metrics of the underlying capitalist property exchange don't permit any other typology. And that also has a lot of problems in terms of how it relates to the city, because you are always dealing with an internal, let's say, ethics of the interior, and the exterior becomes only a very minor condition. So I don't know if that answered your question. I'm sorry.
Robe?
That is very fascinating, Jack. The question I have is that when you have a controlled environment, like for example the gallery space or the pavilion, and then you talk about reality as in the context of pure financial pressures, and then an architect really has to work between these two. What about and there you locate, for example, the say space-time collapse as your sort of a very important point of sort of experimenting or entering into the whole discourse of I'm just trying to understand that if in real context, and I mean by real context I mean perhaps not just financial pressures, but also the way in which people actually collapse space and time in different contexts. So, or they mix, for example, different kinds of activities. So something which we have often talked about, which Matthias also mentioned, is that the home as only a space of living is just a very limited definition of that space and structure for a large number of people. So in the Asian context, the shop house, the tool house, the home factory is already a kind of collapse. So I'm not even quite sure I have a question, but I'm just little uncomfortable about just taking two very strong sites, which is the controlled environment, which is almost like a lab, and then you have the reality, which is really about financial pressures alone in a certain context. And then, while space and time are very important, but we still see them as very abstract experiments. We don't see them in the context of how they would translate in terms of a lived context of a different kind.
I think we've touched on a couple of times today the importance of rules in structuring communal life and the possibility of, let's say, a luxury commons. And in a way, what I began to mention with the sharing economy is not principally a mobilization of resources in space. It's really a mobilization of resources through time. And neoliberalism itself is actually, because it's so heavily dependent on debt, it's effectively the collapse of the future into the present by effectively buying the future, your future labor, and therefore locking you into power relations of the present. So in a way, what I really try to do is start from a certain type of political position and then find the models which can support that. And the main, we talked about it with the kitchen, which I think is extremely important. I mean, when you have a kitchen which is a linear galley, which is designed to maximize the efficiency of, let's say, one woman who's staying at home during the day. In Britain, I have Italian friends, for example, who occupy one of these 1960s social housing. And because cooking occurs in a different way, it becomes completely impossible to change that relationship. And that goes, I think, we were talking about other spaces of the house. That goes equally for the bedroom. If you think of the 1950s, it was very common for a couple, a married couple, because in those days it would be very difficult not to be a married couple in one house, they would sleep in separate beds. Now the idea of a couple sleeping in separate beds would seem very unusual. The let's say marital double bed has become the default condition, and indeed we set all of our space standards for bedrooms for the master bedroom, which also highly patriarchal term, around the idea of the double bed. But who is to say? I mean, if we go back to the 19th century, the single-person bedroom was really an invention of the 1850s. You go back earlier than that into Napoleonic era, they used to have the Napoleon bed, which is 2 by 2 meters. The reason for that was that it slept a whole family, and it had no preference for orientation because it was square. I mean, we can't imagine 50 or 100 years into the future what social structures, and I think as architects also, we should be very aware of the fact that, in fact, actually, I'm just going to describe this image. The reason that I've adopted a photorealistic rendering technique recently is as a result of the work on the British Pavilion, which really showed me that space, what's really interesting about architecture is things are both metaphorically and literally true at the same time. So, for example, the head of the table is both metaphorically the head of the household, the kind of ruler of the roost, but also, literally the head of the table. And I think one of the reasons my parents divorced, and I'm really not joking about this, is that we had a circular dining table. And my mother's a great feminist. She always promoted equality in the house. My father comes from a very middle-class English background who struggled a lot, I think, to find his place within the family when it was a circular table. So something as simple as that, I think, can really have very profound effect on how we use space and how we think about. So when I see some of the experiments that have been presented today, I think this is the power of architecture. Through very, very small, often apparently insignificant gestures, you can have colossal impact on social power relations. And so what, you know, in my own work, what I try to do is very much start from what is the social power relation I'm trying to achieve, and what techniques and what, therefore, do I have at my disposal in order to try and achieve it.